Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this public webinar from Engineers Ireland, Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division. My name is Barry McMullen. I'm the chair of that division for the current year in Engineers Ireland. As you can tell from the name, the Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division of Engineers Ireland is a venue for professional engineers across Ireland to meet up, to share, to exchange views, to develop their professional practice, but also to reach out to the wider community, to explain engineering issues and get feedback and interaction and inform our own practice. So this series of public talks, we normally do one most months from about October through to March or April each year, and they're open to the general public, but obviously we're particularly interested in having our own professional members participate in these events as well. So this is our first event for the 2022-2023 season, and I'm delighted that we're joined by Dr. Denis Dineen. Denis, many of you will probably be aware of from his work with SEAI. He's been with SEAI, Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, since 2014. He's had a number of different roles, but he's now a senior energy analyst with the SEAI modelling team. SEAI, as most people will know, are responsible for pulling together the official national statistics and reports on energy usage in Ireland, both on an ongoing historical basis, but also projecting ahead and looking at the outlook for energy use. And you know, by energy use, we mean in all aspects of Irish society. So electricity is what people most commonly associate with energy use, but energy use in Ireland divides roughly equally between electricity, transport and heating. So heating is actually a big element of Irish energy use. And SEAI recently completed a major study investigating heat energy use in Ireland and looking at both the challenges and opportunities for decarbonising it. And it was a very important and strategic piece of work that SEAI undertook. And we're delighted that we have Denis this evening with us to give us an overview and maybe in some areas a more technical deep dive into the outputs from that review. So with that, we'll have about 35 to 40 minutes. Denis will present. While Denis is presenting, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. If you hover over your Zoom window, you should get a Q&A button at the bottom. So please post your questions as we're going along, and then we'll have about 20 minutes to go through those questions and get responses to them. So with that, I'll hand over to Denis. Thanks very much, Denis.
Thanks very much, Barry, and yeah, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to present. So yeah, look, as you've kindly said, my name is Denis Dineen. I work with the modelling team in the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. I guess, as you said, SEAI, it's probably best known by the general public, at least, for our role in implementing a range of government support schemes to encourage sustainable energy, things like home energy upgrades, EV grants, you know, practical supports for businesses, etc. And that's a really big part of our remit. But another aspect of SEAI's work, possibly maybe less well known to the general public, is that of the Research and Policy Insights Division. So this division encompasses many teams, for example, the Energy Statistics team, the RD&D team, we have a Behavioural Economics team, and we also have an Energy Modelling team where I work. So across these teams, really, you know, we're there to be experts on sustainable energy, to provide insights, data, and thought leadership that informs policy, and we're at the forefront of innovative technology and research in the area of energies in Ireland. So I'm just showing you here where to find us on the SEAI website. So you'll see the Data and Insights tab on the top left, and under that you have links to different teams that I just mentioned there, and also to the National Heat Study, which is the topic of tonight's presentation. So under the link there on the left-hand side, you'll see all of the reports and the supporting documentation that I'm discussing tonight. It's all available there to see and to download. So then the National Heat Study. So what is it? So it's a comprehensive analysis of the options for reaching net zero emissions from the heat sector by 2050. So it's been published as a series of 8 technical reports. You can see them here. So really the first 7 reports, kind of starting from the top left corner, are the building blocks of the study. So each of these reports gives a detailed description of the cost and technical potential of different decarbonisation options, such as, for example, district heat, low carbon gases, bioenergy, CCUS, etc. And then it's the final report, the Net Zero by 2050 report, shown here on the bottom right-hand corner, that really brings together all of the different work and presents the results of the modelling done in the study, where all these different technologies compete against each other in the different scenarios. So I won't spend too long talking about the methodology that we used, other than just to make a few points, I guess. The analysis was carried out on SEAI's own National Energy Modelling Framework, which has been developed for and by SEAI over a long number of years, and we consider it a very powerful tool, and we think that the current study demonstrates a lot of its capabilities. One thing I guess it's worth highlighting is that at the core of the NEMF is a detailed simulation of consumer investor preferences and decision making. And we feel this strong consumer focus is a real strength of the model. So it considers consumer behavior using things like willingness to pay curves that are based on surveys of homeowners and businesses, their own self-declared willingness to pay, and their own willingness to accept payback periods. So the graph here shows a simple decision-making journey. So something was happened to trigger a consumer into making a decision. For example, their heating system might reach the end of its life. And then when that happens, they will consider a range of options open to them. So they could stick with just a simple replacement of their existing technology, or they could look at a new heating technology, or they could look at energy efficiency, or a combination of these. And they will decide the best option for them based on cost and payback periods. So this is this kind of methodology is a useful tool, particularly for simulating policy interventions such as grants. So within this study, we considered a number of different pathways to get to net zero in the heat sector by 2050, and each of these has its own narrative. So we start, as is often the case, with a baseline. So the baseline included all supports that were in place up until 2019, and it's worth pointing out that we model supports rather than targets. So for something like maybe if there's a target, for instance, for like a set number of heat pumps or a set number of retrofits to happen in a particular year, we don't model by just assuming that number of retrofits happens. What we do is we model the actual supports that are in place in terms of the grants and the other kind of support mechanisms, and then it's that consumer-based model that actually decides exactly how many heat pumps or retrofits are actually taken up in the model. So one of the big themes, I guess, that runs through discussions on the future of heat is the role of the gas grid and of renewable gases. So the first scenario that we developed explored a future where there was a policy focus on maximizing the use of the gas grid as a vector to deliver low carbon heat by decarbonizing the gas grid using a combination of biomethane, hydrogen, also some fossil gas combined with carbon capture and sequestration. So if you like, that's kind of one end of a spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we had a high electrification scenario. And this explored a future where policy focused on using the electricity grid really as the main vector to deliver low carbon heat. So it focused more on technologies like heat pumps, electric technologies in industry like electric boilers. And there was a reduced role for the gas grid in this scenario. And then also consequently a greater role for district heating also as an alternative to the gas grid effectively. And then there was a balanced scenario, which, as the name suggests, was sort of a more middle of the road flexible scenario in between those two sort of extremes, if you like, letting more freedom for the individual consumers to decide. Now, while all of those three scenarios, apart from the baseline, met the net zero by 2050, that was the kind of main goal of those scenarios. As I'll show shortly, none of those three scenarios really came close to meeting our 2030 targets, because I guess the main imposition proposed on them was to meet the 2050 overall objective. So when we saw this kind of emerging, we also decided to develop a further rapid progress scenario. And the idea of that scenario was to put an emphasis on early action to really try and meet those 2030 carbon budget targets. So it really looked at stretching all the available policy levers, especially in the early period. So we'll look now at some of the key insights of the report. So the first, and really this is just context rather than a finding of the modeling as such, is that we're not starting from a good place. So heat is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just energy, that's including agriculture. And it's just under 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions. So as Barry mentioned at the start, it's a really big chunk of the overall piece. You can see there the trend in the chart from 1990 to 2020, just to give some context. So we did see a reduction in the emissions from heat during the recession due to falling economic activity. Things like decreased disposable income also led to increased fuel poverty in that time period. But since we emerged from recession in 2014, the emissions from heat have been increasing due to economic growth, increased economic activity, increased disposable income, reduction in fuel poverty. So emissions essentially have been going in the wrong direction in that time. So here we show a breakdown of the heat by sector. So again, these are sort of inputs to the model, really. This is just us characterizing the heat demand in Ireland just as a starting point. And I'm just showing here some context. So starting on the left here, we show the energy use by sector for heat, and we can see that residential and industry are the two main sectors. So between them, they account for about 80% of the energy used for heat. And we can see industry is actually almost as big as residential. And then on the right-hand chart, we see the CO2 emissions from heating split by fuel type. So we can see in this case, residential is significantly more than industry, even though their fuel use was similar. And this is because the residential sector uses a higher proportion of the high carbon fuels like oil and solid fuels compared to industry, which uses more gas. So just focusing now on the residential sector, as it is that largest source of heat-related carbon emissions. So this slide shows residential emissions split by dwelling type and by fuel. So we can see that it is dominated by the emissions of detached dwellings, which predominantly use oil and solid fuels for heat. So those are the higher carbon intensity fuels. And then of course, detached dwellings do tend to be larger dwellings, and they're inherently less efficient than dwellings like detached or apartments as well. So, it really, these homes really must be a focus for policy, these kind of, oil-fired detached dwellings. Looking now at industry, because this is an area that we really tried to focus on also in the study, was to improve our characterization of heat demand in industry. So the top graph here shows energy use in industry split by sector and by fuel. So we can see that metals, food and drink, and cement are really the three largest. So metals here is dominated really by just one site, which is Aughinish Alumina. You can see in most sectors, gas is the main heating fuel. The main exceptions there being the cement and wood products industries. And then the bottom graph shows the same sectors, but this time split by the temperature or the grade of heat required. So this is an important consideration because different alternative low carbon options will only work for certain grades of heat. So we can see that the requirement for high grade heat is really concentrated in cement and metals. And cement manufacture, part of the process, it entails large amounts of process emissions. These are unrelated to energy use, or down to the chemical process of producing cement. So those can't be abated just by moving to renewable heat source, for instance. So really, in the long run, we'll have to see cement manufacture will require some form of carbon capture to abate those process emissions. So those are kind of a special case, really. But most of the other sectors, then, apart from those two, it's really kind of medium or low grade heat. Now, I suppose it's a relative term because, as I say, we would call it our kind of high medium grade heat there is 150 to 500 degrees C. So, a lot of industries in Ireland would consider 500 degrees C to be high temperature. But I guess on the international kind of scale, when you have industries like, steel production and stuff, it's, generally over 500 is what's called high grade heat in that context. So I guess it's a bit relative. So the top chart here again shows the CO2 emissions by fuel for each of the sectors. So that's very similar to the energy use chart on the previous slide, but it's really the bottom chart here is the kind of more important one. So this shows the different technologies that are used in industry by fuel type. And we see the main technologies are gas-powered boilers, CHP units and furnaces, and then cement kilns also, which mostly run on solid fuels. So when we were looking at modeling the industrial sector, it was actually by these technology types that we characterized it rather than by sector or anything else, because it's actually, these individual technologies, boilers, furnaces, that we need to look for what are the direct, possible low carbon alternative replacements. again, more, I guess, kind of context. So there's been, I guess, been more light shed on this in the meantime since the study, but still the overall goal is that Ireland aims to reduce its emissions by 51% from 2018 levels by 2030. So this is for all emissions, including agriculture. So energy will have a greater burden. Now, I think, there has been more detail provided since then on the actual sector emission ceilings, but I haven't updated these slides with those yet. But it's still, the statement still stands true that energy and heat will have to play a larger role than the level 51%. So there's no specific target for heat in the climate action plan. It kind of cuts across a number of different sectors, but one of the findings of the report really is that, yes, the climate action plan targets that relate to heat will be very, very hard to achieve, and they're very ambitious, but still, even if we were to achieve them, that is unlikely to be enough for heat to meet a pro rata share of the required emissions cuts. So on this chart here, if you look at the left-hand side, so the columns show the annual average rate of emissions reductions achieved in each of those scenarios that I described that we modeled as part of the study in each of the first 2 carbon budget periods. And then the red dashed lines show the average annual reductions for all greenhouse gas emissions to keep within the carbon budget period. So again, that's just the average across the whole of the economy. It's not the specific one for heat, but that was just the kind of general numbers that we had. And so, I mean, effectively, the heat number is going to be an even bigger reduction than that. So if we look at the balance scenario, so this includes a lot of kind of increased policy measures in order to meet those CAP21 targets, such as the kind of retrofit rates and the heat pump deployment rates that are targeted in CAP21. But as we can see, even if we meet those, that's still not nearly enough to allow heat emissions to contribute a proportional share to meeting the carbon budgets in the first 2 carbon budget periods. So this really was the finding that was the reason that we went on to develop this rapid progress scenario, was to try and develop a scenario that could try and stretch to meet those targets. So the rapid progress scenario, it looked at unprecedented levels of policy support. It looked at bringing forward the phase out of fossil fuels into the mid to late 2020s compared to the mid 2030s in the other scenarios, and looked at retiring fossil fuel technologies early before their natural lifespans, really just trying to accelerate all of the actions and all of the policy to try and make an impact in that first 5 to 10 year period. So even then, the rapid progress scenario only comes within budget in the second budget period, and it still misses the cumulative 2030 target across the first 2 budget periods. So really, there was the finding there that the modeling shows that an unprecedented level of additional policy effort that goes beyond the current heat-related targets in the CAP 21 is required if heat is to play a proportional share in meeting the carbon budget limits. So the main focus of this study was to, as I said, was to explore key pathway options to get to net zero by 2050. So the scenarios with the lowest overall cumulative emissions, we found, are the ones that make use of the technologies that are commercially available today. So that's technologies like electrification and district heating. And then the scenarios that wait for potentially promising technologies in the future, like maybe hydrogen, have higher cumulative emissions because effectively you have to wait longer to lower your emissions until those technologies become more mature. And again, that's the key finding of the report. So, and again, look, the reason is simple, is that the scenarios that rely on electrification, they decarbonize faster because those electrification technologies are available now. And as I said, the decarbonized gas scenario, yes, it relies on biomethane in the short term, but there's a limited resource potential there of biomethane. So really it has to wait until hydrogen comes in at scale to allow more complete decarbonization of the heat system. And that requires, waiting until the 2030s to decarbonize a large chunk of the system. And so that necessitates larger cumulative emissions. Of course, the rapid progress scenario, the way it was designed, sees the lowest cumulative emissions of all the scenarios. And this, again, benefits highlights the benefit of early action. But again, just to say that what we included in the rapid progress scenario was really unprecedented levels of policy effort. So the study identified a set of key actions that we recommended that policymakers can act on now to deliver emissions cuts. So in this section, we'll go through some of those and outline the evidence that we found to support them. So The first finding that we had was that district heating offers significant additional potential, that it's a proven mature technology and that it's available now. So again, this is speaking to the necessity to really leverage and lean on the technologies that are available now as much as is possible. So we invested a lot of effort in just understanding the potential of district heating, and we find significant additional potential compared to previous estimates. And this was down to a more detailed analysis of how the costs of rolling out district heating scale with heat density. So previous work carried out by ourselves would have indicated that district heating networks weren't really viable unless the heat density exceeded 10,000 megawatt hours per kilometer. But in this work, we were able to show that actually the capex of district heating begins to plateau once heat density exceeds even 1,000 megawatt hours per kilometer. And there's a big difference between those two. So above that 10,000 megawatt hour per kilometer threshold is only 2.5% of all small areas. But above the 1,000 is something close to 50% of all small areas, or 50% of all building heat demand also. So there's a really big difference, and that's really the main reason for this finding that district heating could potentially play a much larger role than was previously thought. So this map illustrates the results of the modeling at the time of the publication of the heat study. So you could say it was sort of a first iteration of a spatial analysis. And what it showed was small areas, that the small areas that were most suitable for district heating were really widely dispersed throughout Ireland. But we were clear from the start that really further, more detailed analysis is required to establish the most suitable candidate areas for district heating. And we've already made a start on some of that more detailed spatial analysis since the publication of the heat study. So we haven't published it yet, but you can see here just a screenshot of the type of outputs of the work we've been looking at. So the chart here shows the heat density for commercial and public sector heat demand for Louth. And looking at those sectors reflects the importance that these sectors have to act as anchor loads for prospective district heating schemes. So even this is still a high level analysis really, and it's intended that this work will lead to identification of more areas for more detailed site specific feasibility studies that will really start pointing to the actual feasibility of this range of locations for rolling out district heating to hit our ambitious district heating targets. So looking at what energy sources were used in the model for district heat, in all scenarios, we see a prominent role for both air source and ground source heat pumps, and also potential for biomass. Now, there's a couple of kind of caveats to say here, I guess. We were conservative in our approach to heat sources, and we definitely had some data limitations, particularly in relation to waste heat. So we would expect that with better data, we would see more waste heat coming into the model, but it was kind of a limitation on the modeling there really. So we were kind of keen to emphasize that there is, as I say, more potential for low cost heat sources that were outside of the scope of the study also. For instance, any potential new power stations should be made ready for heat extraction that could potentially feed into district heating systems. And also outside of the scope, because there just wasn't sufficient data at the time of the study, was the potential for deep geothermal heat sources. And the GSI are investigating and doing background work now that's showing that there could be large potential for ground source for geothermal for heating and heat storage. So I mean, I guess probably the bigger question is, why do we not already have district heating? Many countries across Europe do, and it's a very mature and very successful technology. So it's clear there's not technological barriers. Really, the barriers there are in terms of regulatory, in planning, financing. So since the publication of the study, actually, there's a number of multi-department, multi-agency working groups were established, and they're looking to identify the necessary steps and the likely barriers to rolling out district heating and to propose solutions to those. So those working groups are currently working on that. So another finding of the study was that heat pumps are a very important technology in all scenarios and in all sectors. And they are technically suitable for many building types and even for some industrial processes. So the modeling that we did on this considered a range of factors relevant to their deployment, such as the least cost combination of fabric upgrades to allow the efficient operation of heat pumps, the impact on the electricity network of all the extra electricity demand from electrification, large scale electrification of heat demand, and also the performance and the sizing of heat pumps in maybe some more poorly insulated buildings. So the graph here just shows the different scenarios that we ran and the heat pump penetration across time period. And really the main point is that they're prominent in all the scenarios. So we can see that they mostly come through in the residential sector, which is probably very intuitive. And here they're doing replacing a lot of those oil boilers that we saw were a really big part of the CO2 emissions from the heat sector. Also in industry, we see some boilers being replaced by high temperature heat pumps. And also in the services sector, there's a strong uptake of heat pumps in all scenarios, interestingly, including the baseline scenario for the services sector. So this suggests that potentially there's already economic options there for the services sector to switch to heat pumps, and maybe it's some non-financial kind of other barriers that are there that are actually limiting the potential growth in the services sector. So this is I guess the finding here of the study is that really the aim of the game is to remove fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So we recommend evolving existing policy supports to focus on the replacement of fossil fuels in buildings rather than just a purely fabric first or efficiency first approach. So we want to make it practical and attractive for consumers to switch from their fossil fuel heating systems to low carbon alternatives. And then as the next few slides will show from a consumer's perspective, expensive fabric upgrades, aren't necessarily, they're going to be hard, I guess, to push for, for a very large number of people in the population. And that really we need to start looking at energy efficiency measures as an enabler of low carbon technologies rather than as an end in itself. So within the model, as I said before, the uptake of energy efficiency measures is determined by their payback period. So this slide shows the payback period for fabric upgrade measures in a detached oil home. So oil is the most expensive fuel in the model, so these are kind of optimistic, if you like, payback periods. So you can see it's the the low capital cost, low hassle measures are the ones with the best payback for customers. Things like cavity wall, roof, drafting, and these are the kind of the ones that we've seen that consumers have been doing all along. And it's the higher cost measures like solid wall insulation, for instance, have longer payback periods. The bottom chart here shows the cost effectiveness in terms of the euros per tons of CO2 saved. And you can see it kind of just mirrors the payback periods really. But it's important to consider that, in terms of the tons of CO2 savings, in a way this can be misleading because it only makes sense to talk about CO2 savings if you're considering installing these measures in a dwelling where the fossil fuel heating system is still in place. And again, I'll make the point that really we should be thinking about taking out the fossil fuel system as soon as we can in the retrofit process. So this chart shows the uptake of the savings in the balance scenario for these different energy efficiency measures. So we can see again, as based on the payback periods that we saw on the last slide, the consumers in the model they're choosing the fabric measures that are kind of low cost and low hassle. So it's measures, and then the higher cost, lower, longer payback period measures like windows and solid wall. These are taken up less, although it's worth noting that solid wall insulation does have large cumulative savings, even though it's a small number of instances. So it's clearly an important option for a significant subset of dwellings. But it's worth pointing out also that, again, in this scenario, to get this level of uptake, we had to model very significant incentives where we were modeling grants of up to maybe 80% in some cases to kind of drive this level of uptake of energy efficiency measures. So the finding is that it's really going to be hard to drive large levels of deep retrofit, even with significant grant supports. Another key finding actually is that despite this significant push for energy efficiency in the decarbonisation scenarios, final residential sector energy demand in those scenarios is not actually much less than in the baseline scenario that doesn't have quite as much of a push for energy efficiency. So basically you're looking at like new build dwellings and a kind of rebound effects after the energy efficiency measures basically outpace the savings delivered, and actually demand increases in all the scenarios. So efficiency alone isn't going to get us to reduce emissions significantly. It's really only by replacing the fossil fuel heating systems with low carbon alternatives that we're going to deliver significant reductions. But I guess, of course, the crucial interdependency here is that one of the main low carbon alternatives that we have is heat pumps. And of course, the efficiency and cost effectiveness of heat pumps depends on the thermal performance of the dwelling in the first place. So because of this, current heat pump grants have minimum eligibility criteria based on the heat loss indicator of the dwelling, and these are designed to protect consumers. But I guess the really important question then is, what is the minimum efficiency level that is required for the cost-effective deployment of a heat pump to protect those consumers? And once a house is at that minimum level of thermal performance, where it is cost-effective for the occupants to run a heat pump, then it is crucial that they are incentivized to switch to a heat pump as soon as possible. And if at that point there is an investment choice between doing additional energy efficiency to get your home like right down maybe to an A, but keeping an oil boiler, or staying at that sort of more kind of medium but still adequate thermal performance level and installing a heat pump, then from a decarbonisation perspective, the overwhelming preference there is that people install a heat pump rather than going to the nth degree just on energy efficiency but keeping their oil or gas boiler. So there's a new SEAI pilot scheme. It's in the process of being launched that will support the installation of heat pumps in houses that currently fall outside the minimum performance criteria that we set for our grants, but where our initial analysis suggests that it should still be cost effective for people in those houses to run a heat pump. So we will carry out detailed monitoring of the heat pump operation in these dwellings, and this should give us really invaluable real world data that will help us to better establish what the minimum performance levels might lie, and if we can kind of stretch our current eligibility criteria to make it possible for even more homeowners to avail of heat pump grants to switch their heating systems right now in their current dwelling. And then also that will potentially make it easier for people even below the new level. They still might not have as much work to do to get their house up to the level that they need to install a heat pump. Because deep retrofit is expensive. So optimizing the level of investment we're putting into retrofitting, it has the potential to save many billions of euro on capital investment, both in terms of government grants and also in terms of consumer investment, because of course these funds are limited, obviously in the case of government, but equally in the case of consumers. These are the same consumers who will be facing investment decisions for purchasing electric vehicles or installing solar PVs, etc. So it's important that we we really make the optimum use of the investments that they make. Now, of course, improving building thermal performance also remains an important policy goal for all the co-benefits that we always talk about in terms of improving the energy efficiency of your home. So it improves your health, your well-being, alleviates fuel poverty, increases comfort. But achieving thermal performance levels in excess of the levels required for the effective operation of the heat pump may be better achieved with policies associated with building regulations and planning permissions that would be triggered by building works, like if you're going to carry out a major extension of your home, rather than with the policies that we're using to encourage decarbonisation, which should really focus more on getting it to the level where you can replace the heating system and then replacing the heating system. So the actions there really are, again, from the study, were just to shift our mindset to building decarbonisation really is about elimination of fossil fuel heating systems, and as again we need to raise awareness of the already competitive low carbon heating options available for services sectors that are currently kind of being underutilized. So the next kind of main finding is around bioenergy. So we find that available domestic solid and gaseous biomass fuels are used in all scenarios. We find bioenergy meets a significant portion of heat demand in all scenarios. So between about 7 and 17% of total heat demand is supplied bioenergy in 2030 and 2050. But really, as we've long been saying, and again, what's a key part of the study, ensuring sustainability is fundamental when we talk about the use of bioenergy. So unlike, some other renewable sources, bioenergy does have upstream emissions associated with its use. So this chart shows the upstream emissions that come from potential bioenergy sources. And you can see that in many cases, it's actually quite tight for these sources to keep within the sustainability criteria. You can see, for example, grass silage from biomethane in particular, there's significant risks there of actually increasing emissions if it's not done correctly. So the study assumes good practice, very good practice in growing and harvesting and using biomass fuels, and we acknowledge and highlight as a matter of concern actually that departing from best practice does risk increasing emissions in other sectors, particularly in the agriculture sector. So there have been a number of resource assessments of biomethane in recent years that have shown a wide range of potential. And this is generally down to differing views or assessments on the potential for grass silage. So as part of the heat study, we carried out a detailed spatial analysis of the potential for grass silage and animal slurry to evaluate the overall potential. So we find that it's more expensive than fossil gas used to be. Again, things have moved on since the publication of the study, I guess. But it can be competitive with oil in off-gas grid applications, and can be competitive, even with the old gas prices, if the costs and benefits are shared across all users. But we do show significantly lower potential for biomethane than some previous studies, which we'll discuss in the following slides. So the key reason for the lower estimate of biomethane is the constraints on the sustainable production of grass for anaerobic digestion. So this chart shows here on the left-hand side the total grass land that's available. And then we have a waterfall of all the different environmental constraints that we applied that limit the use of land for growing energy crops. So you can see the list in there. There's environmentally sensitive areas, soils not suitable for cultivation, elevation, slope, and this leads to a much smaller area then that are suitable for energy crops on the right. So another constraint, as we saw, the grass must be mixed almost 50-50 with slurry if you're going to meet those sustainability criteria. So this chart just shows the level of detailed spatial analysis that we went into to look at the spatial distribution of grass and slurry to make sure that the resources aligned across the country. And really, probably one of the important points is that direct transposition of EU legislation on sustainability will not alleviate the risks of using biomass in most sites in Ireland, because most sites in Ireland fall outside of the mandatory thresholds where sustainability governance applies. So we need more nationally appropriate sustainability governance that includes the sites of the scale that we're likely to see in Ireland. And that's another key finding of the study. So long-term signals are important for consumers in their decision-making, particularly in the industrial sector. There are several technology options that require long-term central planning to deliver, and there are several interdependencies there. So that kind of leads us to a number of things that we need to start looking at, longer-term future decisions that we need to start actually actively making now. So one of the things in the study was looking at determining the future role of the gas grid. So all of the scenarios that we developed show a reduced role for the gas grid. So we can see here on the left-hand side, current gas use. So about half of all gas use is used for electricity generation. And on the right-hand side, then we see the results in the different scenarios in the different milestone years. So if we look on the right-hand side there at 2050, even in the decarbonized gas scenario, which is the one that really focuses on using the gas grid for decarbonization, we see a reduction of about 25% on gas use from current levels. And then in the other scenarios, the grid connected gas use reduces by about 60 to 75%. So in all scenarios, we see a reduction of gas use for electricity generation. So this reflects the decarbonization of the electricity grid. That'll have to happen. And in the high electrification scenario, we also see the elimination of the residential and public. So this kind of yellow and green here bars. We see the elimination of those also. So this reflects a situation where the distribution grid is actually phased out, and what you're left with is a few large gas users connected directly to a transmission system. So you're talking about a few maybe large power plants that use CCS potentially, and a few large high temperature heat industrial users. Of course, in the future, right now, it's all fossil gas, but it's not going to be all fossil gas in the future. So this chart shows the transition of the gas supply from the current situation on the left-hand side, where it's all fossil methane, to on the right-hand side, where it's a combination of hydrogen, biomethane. And there is some fossil gas there, but it has to be combined with carbon capture and storage to meet our 2050 targets. So one of the crucial points here is that hydrogen doesn't show up in significant quantities until really the mid-2030s and the 2040s. It's also worth noting, of course, that not all hydrogen is used for heat. This is actually total gas use, so it does include the power sector use of gas and hydrogen also. So another thing worth noting about hydrogen is that our study finds that it'll be expensive. It'll be more expensive than gas used to be, at least. I mean, current gas prices are sort of very abnormal. And we find that it'll be as expensive as electricity. And this chart really just illustrates the kind of range of different sources that we examined for potentially providing green hydrogen. And it's I guess the biggest one there, but you can see there's a break in the chart in the time series, is the floating offshore wind. And you'll notice at the end of the chart here that there's nearly 100 terawatt hours of potential. So that's actually twice our current gas demand potential there in terms of producing hydrogen. So there may be significant export opportunities, as long as there's a market for it. And this slide really just builds on that point again about the competitiveness of hydrogen. So we see here industry heating demand by technology and by the grade of heat, so whether it's high temperature or low temperature. And we can see hydrogen in purple, and then the electric technologies and heat pumps are in green and blue respectively. So again, the kind of, I guess, current wisdom is that hydrogen is needed to decarbonize industry that currently uses gas. But our analysis shows that a large share of that kind of medium grade heat demand, its electric technologies and heat pumps actually outcompete hydrogen. So again, if we expect hydrogen to be as expensive as electricity, then if a heat pump is a suitable alternative, then a heat pump will work out at less than half the price per unit of delivered energy than hydrogen, if a heat pump is a suitable technology for you. So that's kind of the basis on which some of these electric technologies are actually outcompeting hydrogen in the model. So another really key question is looking at when fossil fuels will be phased out. So the model work that we did suggested without a fossil fuel phase out, there will be a significant amount of fossil fuel use, right out to 2050, even under very high carbon price scenarios. So really, you do need at some point in your timeline to actually start banning fossil fuel use if you're going to get to net zero. So the slide here shows the assumptions that we made. So again, initially we started out with the three kind of scenarios: the balance, the high electrification, and the decarbonized gas scenarios. And these are shown here in purple, the different phase out dates that we assumed for the different sectors. So the key factor when you're looking at the phase out dates that we looked at is the technology life. So for buildings, if you assume 15-year technology life for a typical boiler, that implies that the latest date that if you're interested on net zero by 2050, then the latest date that you can to ban fossil fuel technologies is 2035, and that gives 15 years for those to work out of the system so that you can be net zero by 2050. But as I said, when we were on those scenarios, we found that none of those were come close to meeting our 2030 targets. So if you're going to keep it in carbon budgets and you're focused on meeting the 2030 targets, then you really need to pull forward those fossil fuel bans into the late 2020s. And then, of course, for industry, tech life is probably more like 25 years than 15 years. And we didn't think it would be realistic for to impose a ban that early on industrial technologies. But then, if we do allow industry to install fossil fuel technologies out past 2025, 2030, then that does imply that if you want to be net zero by 2050, that you're going to have to look at early retirement of those fossil fuel technologies and writing off the value of those technologies over a shorter time period. So something that we've been working on with policymakers in the meantime since the publication of this study, to develop a policy statement on the need for clear timelines for fossil fuel phase out, and that work is ongoing. So then coming to the end now, so another thing I won't spend too much time talking on it here, but it's just another actually key part of the picture that we do need to consider. So the target for carbon neutrality by 2050, it will require some form of negative emissions technology if we actually have to get down to zero. So we did model a number of high and low deployment trajectories for CCS based on a detailed assessment of suitable sites in Ireland. So we looked at, for example, at a minimum, industries that had significant process emissions, so you're talking about cement there, for example, they will require CCS. That's about the only way that you can address those process emissions if you need to get down to absolute zero. And then at the upper end, then we considered more larger scale deployment of negative emission technologies to try and get down to zero, for example, using bioenergy, carbon and capture and storage for electricity. And really, it's just to make the point that it kind of raises important questions. For example, there's a limited number of sites that are suitable in Ireland for bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So if we're deciding that actually, we actually need that level of negative emission technologies to get to zero, then we need to start kind of communicating that to those sites before they decide to go and invest in alternative decarbonisation options. So we really need to start planning for it. I mean, I think there's a sense, people talk about CCS as something that's 20 or 30 years away, but really, if we are going to rely on it, in the next, before 2050, in the 2040s, we really do have to start actually actively planning for it, start really seriously thinking about it. Where is it going to be? What are the sites, that are going to use this technology? And start really just taking it seriously and take a really integrated, balanced kind of approach to how we're going to plan for it. So of course, there's several things that were, that require further work. Of course, the study doesn't answer everything. So we provide a number of areas where we highlighted for that were kind of priorities for further analysis. So, I mean, some of the questions, for example, how do the different scenarios that we developed perform in kind of, stress events like, high impact weather events, for example, like a beast from the east, does a decarbonized gas scenario perform better than an electrification scenario in that situation? How does the industry sector kind of develop in potentially an era where they have higher fuel costs? There's a lot of, much further work and more detailed kind of questions and analysis to be done on a whole range of areas. So I'll just leave you with this summary here. There's many things even on the summary points here that I didn't get to touch on in the presentation here. Like, an important one, for instance, is the role of solid fuels for secondary heating in the residential sector, and there's many more there. And so there's already currently more work underway, but there's an awful lot more work is needed across all of these areas. But I'll leave it there for now, and I'll hand you back to Barry, and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks a million, Dennis.